teach in the Department of English and in Jewish Studies, and have done for a long time, in spite of these golden curls. So that I think probably, I'm sure there are other people in the room who share my memory, but Althea Straum and I may be among the few who were at the first of the Straum lectures 31 years ago. Lazar Weiner, a magnificent musician, led this distinguished company of poets, artists, scholars, all thanks to Sam and Althea Straum and the lectureship, which is tonight in its third and final version of meeting of what is, as I say, the 31st in a series that I'm sure will go on as long as we have, well, we won't run out of a willingness to talk on the part of Jews and scholars of Judaism. Tonight's lecturer is, and by now most of you, I recognize faces, will know Anita Norwich, who is a professor of English and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. Anita has written wonderfully about the brothers Singer, Joshua and Yitzhak, and a wide range of other topics with particular sensitivity on the broad subject of translation. And I want to say that it's my particular pleasure, since I also teach from an English department, Jewish literature in translation, to witness and receive Anita's generosity in the reception, not only of our Yiddish literature in translation, but in many art forms, because there are such things. There are guardians of the golden Mamaloschen who don't do that, sad to say. Don't let it move about the world with the ease that Anita Norwich does. And I'm thinking of the other night of her assertion that so far from being a provincial tongue, that Yiddish is a cosmopolitan tongue, and she noted that all of its great authors were at least bilingual, and that usually means that at some point in their literary careers they had a choice of what language to write in: Russian, Yiddish, English, German, you name it. The great Jewish Yiddish linguist Max Weinreich wrote a magnificent essay on Yiddish bilingualism, as he called it. The language itself is if not polylingual, and by that he meant mostly its Germanic and Hebraic components. But from the word go, it's a language that reaches out into the world, picks up fragments and alters them beautifully. I remember on the Rue de Rosier in Paris, an old Jewish neighborhood, listening to two Jewish women kvelling about the family, and one of them, speaking of her sons, said that zwei Garçonen, these zwei Garçonen were incomparable, two boys, pluralizing garçon, as if it were Yiddish, and of course enumerating it in Yiddish. Happens all the time. I think that Yiddish is itself a polyglot culture, and it brings together, as Jewish Studies does, a polyglot and a very diverse range of scholars, and they're represented in any department of Jewish Studies. Anita and I have in common that our own home departments, and indeed our own degrees, are both in English literature and indeed in Victorian English literature, out of which, but to which I'm sure we're both totally loyal, but out of which we are drawn into the study of Yiddish and Yiddish in translation. I want to add one other magnificent polyglot form of the Yiddish culture that Anita is indirectly responsible for propagating, and that is through her very talented, bright, funny, witty, warm brother, Sam Norwich, who is the publisher of The Forward, a newspaper that has been published Yiddish since 1897, and which now, not to be restrained in any way, has, I believe, a Russian, no more Russian, I'm sorry to hear that, but has had a Russian edition, a Yiddish edition, and of course right now, English. And so the polyglot, generous, cosmopolitan, multilingual experience of studying, reading, enjoying Yiddish with the help of Anita Norwich will continue now with a lecture variously titled, we were discussing this before, Becoming American, Yiddish in the Golden Land, Die Goldene Medina, to you. Okay? Anita Norwich.
Thank you, Joe. Before I actually begin this last lecture of the week, I just want to express once again my great thanks to Althea Strom, to the UW Judaic Studies program. We've been talking this week, or I've been talking this week in broad and quite specific terms about translation in a variety of ways. One is translation as a kind of, what I've been suggesting is a kind of betrayal, right? That is, that the original has to necessarily be betrayed in some way to be rendered in another language, but also translation as a kind of rescue, making the original, in this case Yiddish, available to ever broader populations. There's a quotation in the Talmud, in Kiddushin, where Rebbe Yehuda says, I'm not given often to quoting the Talmud, so you'll indulge me at this moment, because the quotation is quite apropos. Rebbe Yehuda says, one who translates a verse literally is a liar. One who adds to it is a blasphemer and a libeler. That is, if you are, this has been part of our discussions at each turn, right? Do you translate literally? Well, if you're translating literally, you're lying, because you're not rendering this culture into that culture in a way that can be understood. If you change too much, you're blaspheming against the sacredness of the text and libeling. These are, again, rather daunting standards by which to measure oneself. Translation does indeed seem to do some kind of violence to one language, some kind of violence to its culturally specific nuances and cadences. But it does that in order for those who live in another language to find it less foreign. There is another version of this betrayal which is quite shocking for Yiddish scholars, and I hope for you. There are lots of Yiddish translations into American, which is sometimes called English, but there are lots of translations of Yiddish literature into American English which have on their cover page, on their title page, somewhere within them, the name of the author, and then translated by, the title, of course, the name of the author, translated by, but nowhere does it say translated from the Yiddish. Right? The most famous and controversial example of this is in much of the work of Sholem Asch. You get the title, The Nazarene, written by Sholem Asch, translated by someone else, and then no sense of where it comes from. That is a rather strong example of a kind of violence done to the original. What I'd like to do tonight, with your indulgence, is to look at very closely, not only at what is lost in translation, but at what is gained in translation, by looking very closely at a couple of poems. And I hope that the close look that we're going to pay to this will reward the exercise of looking at how translation functions. I have been for many years obsessed, I don't know how else to call it, with an American Yiddish poet named Yankiv Glatstein. Anybody know this name? Couple, okay. And in particular, with one poem of his, which is called A Gute Nacht Welt, Good Night World, a poem that he wrote in 1938. Now, Yankiv Glatstein was one of the leading modernists of American Jewish culture. He was a leader of a group of writers called, or one of the leaders of a group of writers called the Insichisten, the introspectivists. These were poets who insisted on free rhyme, on free rhythm, who insisted that the function of the poet, the responsibility of the poet, was to express the self, to express innermost feeling. One Yiddish critic who referred to modernist Yiddish poetry said that before modern Yiddish poetry, he was talking about a prior group, the youth, but also this also reflects on the Inzichisten, that earlier, at the turn of the century, into the 20th century, Zisha Landau called Yiddish poetry the rhyme department of the Jewish labor movement. Right? It's a great line. The rhyme department of the Jewish labor movement, by which he meant, obviously, that all that Yiddish, and it's a rather unfair statement, but nonetheless a catchy one. He meant that Yiddish poetry was giving expression to workers' rights, to political issues, but not to modernist themes or concerns, namely the self. And Glatstein, as I said, was one of the leaders of this movement. And then when he published this poem in the journal Inzich, by the way, in the Self, in 1938, it was understood as a poem that changed the Yiddish literary world. I say this without exaggeration, right? Here was the leading modernist of the 20th century in Yiddish, in America, coming forward and saying, good night to the world. We're done with you. There's nothing here for us. This is April 1938 in New York, right? We can't possibly live in this post-Enlightenment world outside. Let's all return to the ghetto. Now, ghetto, you have to understand here, does not mean ghetto, as in Nazi ghetto. Right? In 1938, there is no such ghetto. There's no imagination yet of such a ghetto. When Glatstein says, let's go back to the ghetto, he's talking in metaphoric terms, in symbolic terms. He's talking about the Italian ghetto, or he's talking about the Lower East Side, or London's East End. That's what ghetto means to him. But the understanding was largely that Glatstein was now saying, okay, we're done with America, we're done with modernism, we're done with modernity, we're done with post-Enlightenment thought. Let's just go back to what we know. I should say at the outset that I want to argue against this understanding of the poem you're about to read. I think what Glatstein reveals at this moment for Yiddish culture and more broadly for Jewish American culture is an extraordinary tension between the outside world and the Jewish world, the more contained Jewish world. And I want us to look at the struggles, the tensions between those two worlds. And I'd like to do it in a number of ways. First, whether or not you understand Yiddish, if you don't, just close your eyes for a moment. I'd like you to hear Yankiv Glatstein reading his own poem. This was a recording made well after the poem. I think it was made sometime in the 60s, but it was still made by Glatstein reading his own poem. And as you listen to it, think of the tone with which he is speaking, if you would, okay? Can we play that?
Gute Nacht, Welt. A gute Nacht, breite Welt. Große, stinkende Welt. Nicht du, noch ich verhackt im Teuer. Mit dem langen Chalat, mit der feierlicher geler Latt, mit dem stolzen Trott auf mein eigenem Gebot, geh ich zurück in Ghetto. Bischof, sie tritt alle geschmatte Spuren. Ich walge sich in dein Mist, Leub, 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 so heukert jüdisch Leben. Cheirem Welt auf deine treffende Kulturen. Hat alles es verwiest, stäub ich sich in dein Stäub, treurig jüdisch Leben. Chaserischer Datsch, feindlicher Lach, Amole Ganef Land von Säufen und Fressen. Schlappere Demokratie mit eine kalte Sympathie kompressen. A gute Nacht, elektrisch zur Chutzpe Welt, zurück zu mein Kerosin, Chelem im Schotten, ewigen Oktober, dribne Stern zu meine krumme Gassen, heukerigen Lanternen, meine Schemes, mein Swarbe, meine Gmores, zu der halbe Sugies, zum lichtigen Ivredeitsch, zum Din, zum tiefen Main, zum Cheuf, zum Gerecht, Welt ich spann mit Fried, zum stillen Getterrecht. A gute Nacht, ich gebe dir Welt zu Steier, alle meine Befreier. Nimm zu, die Jesus Marxis, werk sich mit ihrem Mut, krapier über a Tropfen von unser getäuft Blut. Und ich hab hoffen, as Chotscher Samzir geht teuf, tog ein, tog ois mein Warten, es will noch räuschen grüne Blätter auf unser Bäum dem Verquarten. Ich darf kein Trest nicht. Ihr geht zurück zu Dalai Lamas von Wagners Getzmusik zu Nieden, Brummen. Ich kusch dich, verkoltend jiddisch Leben. Es weint in mir der Fried von Kummen.
Within months of its publication, this poem had been translated into English. And over the next 60 years, it would be translated at least another 7 times. That's an extraordinary number for any Yiddish text. Most of the time, we lament how few translations there are, how much is missing from Yiddish literature in English because it hasn't been translated. But there are some of these texts, and this is, for my money, primary among them, that have been translated many times. And in looking at their translations, we can, as I'm going to try to suggest tonight, we can trace the trajectory of American Jewish culture and the status of Yiddish in America, its reception, the mythic burdens of memory keeping that it was compelled to assume, its shifting reputation as an authentic carrier of Jewish culture. In English, this would be 8 translations. Don't try to read them all, because it may be hard. But in English, when it was first translated by Joseph Leftwich, it was understood as a battle cry urging a return to the boundaries of tradition. Look at the title of this. It's not Goodnight World. It's the absolute opposite. It's Back to the Ghetto. Right? One author followed him in this, but most of them went back to the original title. Back to the Ghetto firmly fixes for the English reader a particular and controversial message of the poem. Repeatedly, Leftwich and others added words and whole phrases that were meant to underscore the finality of this return. We're going back to the ghetto, and we're not going anywhere, and we'll never come out again. Look at the highlighted words, right? Good night, big world, great big stinking world. Not you, but I banged the door and break off the latch. This doesn't appear in the Yiddish. This is an addition that is meant precisely to say, this is irrevocable. Let's make it even stronger. Let's keep that in mind. Now the world is a great big stinking world, and the latch is broken. There is a tradition that some of you may know. A couple of you actually came up and talked to me about it after one of these talks. There's a tradition in Yiddish literature of translating and adding verteidigt und verbessert, which means translated and improved. Right? Der König Lear, King Lear, verteidigt und verbessert von, right? King Lear translated and improved by the Yiddish translator. Or Hamlet, right? Verbessert und verschönert von, right? Improved and beautified by the translator. Now, it turns out that we can't find a single text that actually says verteidigt und verbessert of Shakespeare's plays. One of your previous Strom lecturers, Michael Stanislavski, has done a serious search for these and has assured me that there is not one to be found in the Shakespeare canon. Nonetheless, the strength of that image verteidigt und verbessert, stays with us in Yiddish translations. There is an expectation that Yiddish will take over or be taken over, and the change will be so great that we have to claim an improvement upon it. I asked you when you listened to the Yiddish, even if you didn't understand the Yiddish words, to listen for the tone of the reading. And I think the question of tone in this poem is absolutely crucial. Right? There are various ways of understanding it. The first one is probably defiance. Not you, but I shut the door on you, wide world. Not you, but I decide. But I think that you also hear in that a tone certainly of sadness, but also of inevitability. He's shutting the door because there's no alternative. This is 1938. What doors are open? So it's a little bit like shutting the door and saying, you can't fire me, I quit. That's a different kind of defiance. And that's the kind of defiance, I think, that we hear in this poem. He is not doing this at his own command. The earliest translations of the poem are at much greater pains to diminish the tension that Gladstein himself emphasizes. That is, they are at much greater pains, as I've been suggesting, to emphasize the proud and unequivocal nature of the speaker's return to the ghetto. And I want to look at just 3 lines in order to illustrate this point. Gladstein says in the Yiddish, mit dem stolzen Trott auf mein eigenem Gebot gehe ich zurück in Ghetto. And look at how each of the translators have rendered this. With proud step and mien, at my own command I go back to the ghetto. With a proud stride, because I want to, of my own free will. All of these ever so mildly highlighted words are added in by the translators in order to emphasize, I am doing this, right? At my sole command, of my own free will, right? Each of them makes that a much stronger point. The last 3 that we have here are, I would suggest, a lot more restrained. They simply render the lines that Gladstein gave us. Right? With proud step, at my own command, I go back. I want to suggest that in the differences between these 2 groups, the first 5 and the last 3, we can discern 2 major shifts that occurred in the 1970s. One that occurred in Jewish culture and American culture, and one that occurred in literary culture around translation issues. In the 1970s, we saw the emergence of a number of pivotal works about translation, in translation theory, which spun off into other works. One was Walter Benjamin's The Task of the Translator, which appeared in English for the first time. The other was George Steiner's After Babel, which appeared in the middle of the decade. The 70s, you'll remember, is also the period in which Isaac Bashevis Singer's reputation soared in English translation, in which he won the Nobel Prize, and where we saw a marked rise in the number and quality of translations and in the market of translations. That is, translation from Yiddish into English became more common. At the same time, the increasing assertiveness of Jewish culture in America is also a product of this decade. And it can be traced both to the Arab-Israeli War of 1967 and to a lesser extent of 73. It can be traced just as well to the US Black Power movement and the Roots movement, which created a kind of ethnic consciousness throughout the nation that Jews and Yiddishists also took part of. There was, I'm suggesting, now a model for particularity, for reclaiming an ethnic heritage or a racial heritage, and there was also a model for Jewish power as well. These earlier translations addressed a beleaguered Jewish world that was still in mourning after the Holocaust. The later translations addressed a remarkably more confident Jewish world. They appeared in the middle of a renewed interest in Yiddish literature and other identifiably Jewish markers, including the Holocaust. And if they appear rather less belligerent than the earlier translations, it's no doubt because they emerge from a different aesthetic and political sensibility. The language that Glattstein himself uses to talk about this shift or to signal this transition from one world to another world, the wide world to the Jewish world, or the Jewish world to the wide world, is very pointed. He uses words that come from the religious world. He talks about trefene Kulturen, treif cultures, non-kosher cultures. He talks about geschmatte Spuren, traces, converted traces. And he talks about this culture being put into cherem, being put into banishment, excommunication, as it were. But all of these are languages, are words from the religious world, and they are all words that caused the translators, again, tremendous trouble. Right? Apostate, conversion, what do we do with all of these? There's a, the images that Glattstein uses to talk about the Jewish world that he is presumably now embracing, look at them. You can see them yourselves. Look at the adjectives, the descriptive words that he uses in order to describe the Jewish world that he's embracing now. Dust and mire, crippled, waste, desolate, dusty, miserable. Don't we all want to go running back to that warm and embracing world? Right? That is, this is clearly a sign of the tension that this return is causing him. And now, for about 3 minutes, I want to do the thing that people dread having literary critics do. I want to talk about a punctuation mark. Okay, but there's really a reason for this, right? There's part of the tension and part of the meaning in this hinges on a comma. Isn't this like the worst joke about a literary scholar, right? And where to place it. Right? I wallow in your filth. Whose filth? Is it the filth of the dusty, miserable, waste, desolate Jewish world? Some people are shaking their heads in horror. What is she? How could she possibly say such a thing? Or is it the filth of the outside world that is now attacking the Jews? And the answer to that question depends on the punctuation. I regret to inform you. Right? Now, we could vote on this, but it might be more productive to look at what translators are trying to do with this. Right? In your dust and mire I sprawl, praise, 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 crippled Jewish life. I roll around in your garbage. I don't know what this is. This is an M dash. Right? Whitman includes a statement that sets it off. Right? I roll my body in your grime. Now here's a semicolon, because now your grime is separated from the glory, glory, glory to you Jewish life. Right? Grime may be outside, glory is what's inside. Let's keep those separate. Glattstein himself used a comma after this line. And that's what I mean about the ambiguity and the tension. Because if you make this all one sentence, it's not entirely clear what is being called dirty and dusty. We know what's being praised. And you know the language of praise, praise, praise. This is again religious language. This is kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. This is part of a liturgy. And here the praise is directed at the Jewish world, but it's calling attention to itself, reminding us of how much difficulty it caused Gluckstein himself. In the next stanza, this is a wonderful translation issue. Two of the translators leave out the next stanza. I think you'll see why in a moment. In the second stanza, the poem rejects the enemies of the Jewish people. Right? It says in the Yiddish, Chazerische Dutch, Ippesticke or feindliche Liach, Amolik Ganef. That is, it says, piggish German, hateful Polak, thieving Amalekites. Romania is an interesting translation for Amalekite. And not unique. That is, it is. Why? Yeah, it's very funny. Somebody in the front said that's funny. Okay, so the question is, what's wrong with calling them thieving Amalekites? And the obvious answer is that an American audience will not understand, piggish German maybe, hateful Polak maybe, but what's a thieving Amalekite? The Amalekites, of course, are the enemies of the Jews who pursued them as they made their way out of Egypt, pursued to kill them. But I think what's going on in this translation into Romania, I hope I'm not offending anyone in the audience, is that it's a calque from, there are any number of not nice Yiddish jokes about Romanians as thieves, which we will not tell. But the word thieves leads a number of these translators to go for the next connection, which can't be Amalekites, but can at least, because of the thieves, become Romanians. The question at the poem's center is, what is it that Gluckstein is returning to? He says simply, back, zurück. He doesn't say who's going back, and he doesn't say where they're going back to. But in a way that makes him very much the modernist, he goes back through the texts of the Jews. My sacred pages, my Bible, my Gemara, I don't like, okay, let's do this one. My straight pages, my 24 books of the Bible, my Talmud, the puzzling questions, the bright Hebrew Yiddish, to law, to deep meaning, to duty. Right? Through the texts, to the law, to deep meaning. And again here, I want to focus on that word meaning. He uses a breathtakingly resonant word here. He writes, zum tiefen Main, right? To deep main, which means meaning or understanding. And it's been translated in various ways that you'll see highlighted there too. But I want to suggest something else with this. He says zum tiefen Main, but Main, the word Main in Yiddish, is one little vowel marking away from mine, right? So it's not, and when he read the poem, he was reading it as mine, which would be appropriate in his accented, in Lublina Yiddish, right? But the tension between whether he's returning to meaning or to something that is mine, I think is there in the Yiddish and isn't there in the English. He begins that final stanza with the wonderful invocation of the Jesus Marxes. That's literally what he says, the Jesus Marxes, right? Take them back. You may have them. They haven't done us any good. That is, he invokes precisely the names in an aggressive way, he invokes precisely the names of those Jews who have been taken by the rest of the world and in whose names anti-Semitism has been most famously practiced, Jesus and Marx. When he refers to he, I have hope that even though he tarries, he's clearly in Yiddish invoking Ani Ma'amin, the Maimonides edict, right? I have hope that even though he, the Messiah, tarries, he will come. I await his coming. That's not what Glattstein is awaiting, though. It is what the translators are awaiting, for the most part, right? What Glattstein says is that I have hope, but not that the Messiah will come as we go through here. When he says, Ich darf kein Trost nicht, I need no comfort, we know that the exact opposite is true. Comfort, consolation is precisely what he needs now. And then he declares that he is returning to Daled Amos. That's the other key phrase here. Ich gehe zurück zu Daled Amos. I go back to, and the translators are very different in this. Daled Amos, again, some of you are nodding, refers to the metaphoric and sometimes literal fence that Jews construct around themselves and the law. Daled Amos is 4 cubits. It's a measurement beyond which you can't walk on the Sabbath, beyond which you can't carry. But it is also metaphorically, symbolically understood as the fence of the law that Jews construct around themselves. Ich gehe zurück zu Daled Amos. I go back to 4 cubits. The translators do indeed interpret this. I go back to my own city, to my very beginnings, to my house of refuge. They all need some place to go back to that is specified, physical, and comprehensible. I walk again my straight and narrow way. I return to my rightful dwelling. Harshav does indeed say to my 4 walls, which is probably the most literal, and then to our cramped space, and again to my 4 walls. Right? Notice a couple of things here that I think are pivotal. One is, again, this notion that we have to say what this is. It's my home, it's my house, it's my rightful dwelling, it's where I belong, it's my city. But the other thing that strikes me as really important is that every single one of the translators adds my or our, my. That is, they add a possessive. They add a possessive pronoun. This is mine. Glattstein doesn't say it's mine. Glattstein simply says, Ich gehe zurück zu Daled Amos. I go back to 4 walls. I go back to 4 cubits. I go back to, there's no my there. And it's as if you can see each of the English translators having to claim this more strongly than Glattstein needs to claim it. Why doesn't Glattstein need to say my 4 cubits, my anything, our anything? A number of reasons. One is, for a Yiddish poet, it's understood that the Daled Amos is a Jewish space. Another is a grammatical answer, a very simple-minded grammatical answer. Yiddish doesn't need the possessive. There are all sorts of jokes about this too, all of which you can imagine, right? But we don't say mein Mame, mein Haus. We say die Mame, das Haus, right? We don't need we know whose it is without that grammatical addition. At the same time, the fact that Glattstein doesn't say my Daled Amos keeps Gladstein a little safe from having to limit himself to this space. It's not just these 4 cubits that I'm limited to. At the end, he says, Sveint in mir, again, I'm using the Yiddish first, Sveint in mir die Fried von kommen. Literally, it cries, this is closest to Harshav's, it cries in me the joy of coming. Now, notice again here what almost every one of the translators adds to this line. The line is literally, it cries in me the joy of coming. Coming where? If this were a class, I would be asking this as a real question, and some of you would be raising your hands. Failing that, coming where? Back? It's not what the Yiddish says. Home? It's not what the Yiddish says. Daled Amos is also not what the Yiddish says. The Yiddish says simply, it cries in me the joy of coming, not arriving, not the point, not home, not my city, not back. Perhaps, but my point is precisely that what the English writers feel compelled to add, that is the interpretation, the drush, as we say, right? The clarification. Where is he going? I'm coming back. I'm coming back home. I'm returning. Homecoming. That's stronger than what Gladstein is saying, because his emphasis is precisely on movement. It's not on the end point. It's not where you're arriving. It's not where you're going to stop. So that the notion that the poem, as it does in many of the English versions, takes us out of this world back into some circumscribed Jewish world is not the notion with which Gladstein simply leaves us. His translators, I think for the most part, as we've seen, have emphasized the rejection of the wide world in the poem. That's what's clearest in many of these translations, rather than what I think Gladstein is emphasizing, which is the transitoriness of them, that this may come back again. Now, it is true and kind of easy to say that criticizing Yiddish translations has become something of a popular, if still minor, international sport. Right? You can go anywhere in the world and somebody's saying something nasty about some Yiddish translator. But I think that's not the point here, certainly not with these translations. These translations don't merely point to the deficiencies of one translator or another, or to the insights of one translator or another. They rather point to the differences between the audiences at one time and another, and what is needed by each one. I also want to suggest that looking at each of these translations in this way doesn't only comment on the American scene, but also comments back on the Yiddish poem. That is, looking at translations is another way of understanding poems in their original, whether by contrast or by simple comparison. I think that once again, like the other times that we've seen, the English translations tend to mute the more radical ambivalence about Jewish life and the equally radical claims that in the modern world, the individual should not be constrained by the claims of the community. One final example of what I've been arguing as the bolder and more sweeping claims that Yiddish authors tend to make is another Holocaust poem, one that was written at the end of the war in 1945. This is a poem by the Yiddish poet Kadya Molodovsky. And it's called, I've just given you a few lines of this, and it's called El Chanun, God of Mercy. It's a poem, as I said, written in 1945, in which Molodowski says explicitly, clearly, unequivocally, that at the end of this war, in the midst of the horrors that are now being fully revealed, it is time for the God of mercy to give the Jews a rest. El Chanun, Kleib ois anander Volk. God of mercy, choose another people. We are tired. We have no more sacrifices to make. Let others bear the burden of chosenness. This is a theme we heard a lot of at the end of the war and since. Now, Irving Howe, who I understand also gave one of the Strom lectures many years earlier, Irving Howe translated this poem twice. Once in 1969, and once again, almost 20 years later, in 1987. And in the sometimes subtle differences between his two versions, we can trace most dramatically those same changes in American Jewish cultural security that we saw more subtly in the translations of Gladstein's poem. Here are the last 3 lines of Molodowski's poem. Und noch ein Chesed tu zu uns. El Chanun, nimm zu von uns die Schrine von Gaonis. Now, Schrine and Gaonis are both problems, not only for an English translator, but for a listener. They're Hebrew, and they're terms, again, associated with religion. A Gaon is a genius, but particularly a brilliant student of Talmudic and religious teachings. The Schrine is more of a problem. Shekhinah, right? For those of you who are still Yiddishly challenged, the Schrine is often understood as the female presence of God, the female immanence of God. It's translated variously as God's immanence, as divine presence, the glory or radiance of God. And as I said, in mystical thought, it's considered the feminine aspect of God that may be perceived by humans at particular times and in particular places. A Yiddish audience would know all that and would recognize the claims made by invoking God's presence and Israel's genius. These are very proud words, and they are very defiant words. Molodowski, in this poem, rejects absolutely everything that sets the Jews apart, including the very God she addresses. When Howe first translated these lines, he rendered them as, "And, O God of mercy, grant us one more blessing, take back the gift of our separateness." Almost 20 years later, he came back to it, and he changed it quite dramatically. Take back the divine glory of our genius. Gaonis, genius, right? What's the difference between the gift of our separateness and the divine glory of our genius? The difference is 20 years, the same 20 years that saw those changes marked by the 1970s that I was describing earlier. And they're also quite a dramatic difference in claim, in staking a claim for Jews in particular. This one, the gift of our separateness, is much more modest, much more tentative. The later one is not as quiet. It's much more ready to assert. And Catherine Hellerstein, who translated it again in 1990, said, "Deprive us of the divine presence of genius," which is closest to Howe's second one. What we have here, and indeed in all of the considerations of multiple translations I've been tracing, are, I think, remarkable examples of historical and cultural processes at work. Different audiences certainly demand different different understandings of the same text. But more recently, we've also seen, I think, a surprising phenomenon. Recent translations of Yiddish have been more faithful, not only to the words of the Yiddish, but to their defiance, to their tensions, to their ambivalence about modernity, and to their embrace of modernity. As American Jews have gained in security, and as American culture has become more ethnically diverse, sometimes people say as it has become more fractured, there's been a clearer echo of that voice of defiance, ambivalence, tension, and embrace of Jewish thought than we saw in much of the 20th century. Earlier translations were responding to and influenced by mass emigration, the loss of the Eastern European homeland, and finally, and most profoundly, they were responding to the Holocaust. This, I have been arguing, subdued the critique that had always been a hallmark of Yiddish literature. And finally, let me remind you of a story that I'm sure is familiar to some of you, a story that's told about the Septuagint, the first translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. Legend has it that 72 scholars were summoned to Alexandria, led into 72 separate rooms, and they were set to work translating the Bible. The miracle the story tells is that 72 days later, these scholars emerged from their rooms to compare their texts, and they found that they had produced absolutely identical translations. It's a story that speaks to our sense of the sacredness not only of the Bible, but also of translation itself, not one word of which may change the meaning of the original. The joke about the Septuagint, of course, that's told is that the more impressive miracle would have been if these 72 men had been kept in the same room and still come out with the same translation. What would those 8 translators of Glattstein have come up with if they had been locked in the same room? But Yiddish literature, however much we may venerate it, is not sacred text. And in any case, there have been lots of translations even of the Bible, written in different times and under different conditions. Translation, of course, is really a form of interpretation, necessarily changing the original, not only because of linguistic differences, but also because of social, political, economic, historical differences as well. I'm hoping that this week's close attention to multiple translations reminds us not only that Yiddish is not a religion, or that some translators are better than others. I'm hoping that it gives us a new appreciation of the task of the translator. And most of all, I'm hoping that it sends all of us back to the Yiddish texts that have been able to inspire so many translators and readers. The diverse interpretations of these translators points us back to the diversity of the originals and to the modern themes, hopes, expressions of Yiddish literature in the 20th century. Thank you.